Hello and welcome to the Feminists Against Antisemitism podcast. Today's episode focuses on an area of maternity care that remains largely unspoken, but has profound implications for those affected. We're exploring how antisemitism manifests within perinatal services and the impact this has on Jewish women during pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood, as well as the impact on birth workers who support them. We also examine why Jewish experiences are so often absent from equality, diversity, and inclusion frameworks, and what that absence means in practice for care, outcomes, and safety. This episode is hosted by Georgia Ladbury, a public health professional and doula with a particular interest in maternal health and health inequalities. Georgia is joined by two guests working to address these gaps. BJ Woodstein is a writer, translator, and honorary professor specializing in literature and translation, and the author of Be Fruitful, The Jewish Pregnancy and Birth Guide, alongside extensive academic and popular writing on Jewish life, parenting, and culture. Joining BJ is Laura Godfrey-Isaacs, an artist, midwife, writer, and chair of Shifrah UK, as well as the creator of the Maternal Journal movement, whose latest book, Pregnancy and Birth, A Graphic Guide, brings together her work in maternal health, creativity, and education. Together, they are working to develop Shifrah, an initiative aimed at supporting Jewish women and equipping birth workers with the knowledge and resources needed to provide informed, culturally competent care. This is an urgent and necessary conversation that demands our attention. Thank you for watching and for listening.
So, welcome to both of you. I'm Georgia. I'm really pleased to be having this conversation for Maternal Mental Health Week 2026. As a doula and a public health professional myself, maternal mental health and health inequalities are both topics that are really close to my heart. But it's not often that you hear a focus on anti-Semitism specifically in either of those contexts. So it's really nice to be able to address this topic today and bring the current challenges into the spotlight, given the rise in anti-Semitism over recent years. So I thought it'd be good if we could start with just you both introducing yourself and just, give an overview of your links to the birth world and the work that you've done in it over recent years. So should we start with Laura?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Laura Godfrey-Isaacs. I am a midwife. So I work actually in the community in London, and I have done for about 10 years. But I trained late. I was actually 47 when I trained to be a midwife. So I also have a background before that in the arts, in academia, and in creative producing. And I've always been kind of an activist. So I've been involved in a lot of activist campaigns within maternity, within the birth world, around LGBT rights, around autonomy for women in the birthing space and people who birth, around perinatal mental health. And really, not surprisingly, if you think about that history, I've ended up kind of becoming quite an advocate for, the Jewish community within this space since October the 7th. Because, as you said in your introduction, the sort of huge rise in anti-Semitism has been so evident in society and unfortunately within the birth world for particular reasons, which I'm sure we'll go into later in the podcast. So that's what sort of brought me into this space.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Over to you, BJ.
So I'm BJ Woodstein, and strangely, my trajectory is slightly similar to Laura's, although, details differ. But I spent much of my career as an academic in literature and translation. And I also, at the same time, was working as a freelance writer and translator. So we both kind of come from these sort of artsy, creative backgrounds, but also with an interest, particularly for me, in kind of the academic details and some of the kind of nitty gritty of the history. And I'm not saying that Laura's not interested in those things, but that was, kind of my background analyzing texts and culture. While I was at the university, there was a real increase to anti-Semitism at my own university, but also generally in academia. And because much of my activist history had been in LGBTQ rights, because, I'm a gay person, I was kind of surprised to find myself, in a way, advocating for Jews and really working against anti-Semitism. We really had to struggle to start a Jewish staff and student group at the university. There was a lot of negativity around that. People really didn't want us to start that. And that was interesting in and of itself, quite upsetting. I then also became interested in birth and breastfeeding when I had my own children and my own kind of challenging experiences with breastfeeding, and also just being pregnant, being very ill with pregnancy and birth. And so I then trained as a doula and became an IBCLC, so certified lactation consultant. A couple of years ago, I left academia altogether. I'm still an honorary professor, but I don't teach at the university anymore. And I have focused on my other work. And my most recent book is called Be Fruitful, the Jewish Pregnancy and Birth Guide. And as you probably can guess from the title, it's all about Jewish practices and beliefs when it comes to getting pregnant, labor, giving birth, and the postpartum period. And I interviewed lots and lots of Jewish individuals and families and include their stories. And also Laura's featured in the book as well, writing about the placenta, which is really fascinating. So that's my background.
Great. I wonder as well, just for listeners, before we move on, BJ, could you give an overview of what a doula does for people that might not necessarily understand what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, many people sort of think of us as lay midwives in a sense, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the best definition. I always think of it, and Georgia, you might be able to add to it because I know you also work as a doula, as being with the usually birthing woman, but the birthing person, being kind of, the word actually means servant, I believe, but not quite being their servant, but really being there to support them, talking through any choices with them, explaining things to them in language they can understand, because sometimes clinicians come in and just sort of say, this is what's happening. And they use big words that aren't always intelligible and don't always give people a chance to ask questions or to say, what are my options here? They're just told this is being done to you. So doulas help with all of that. I also sometimes think of myself as sort of a bodyguard, kind of helping to keep it a safe space for the person who's giving birth and maybe their family as a whole. Who do they want in the space? Why? What would they like that space to be like? And just kind of supporting them in whatever way I can, antinatally during birth and in the postpartum time as well.
Yeah, so it's that kind of emotional and informational support rather than the clinical support that you get.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's really important, I think, to make that clear to our clients, because it has definitely happened that they have thought I could do something that I really shouldn't be doing. And interestingly, also, doctors and midwives sometimes are really dismissive of us, but also sometimes they seem to think we know more or can do more than we can. I've had midwives who've said things about, if you just sort the cannula or whatever, and you think, no, that is definitely not within the scope of my role. That's not something that I can safely be doing or should be doing.
Cool, thank you. So let's just dive right in then. So I think first question, let's get to the meat of it. How is antisemitism manifesting within healthcare generally and within the maternity and birth world specifically?
Well, I think that there's been a very sort of disturbing embracing of a lot of sort of political activism by healthcare workers individually, particularly sort of a lot of activity on social media, but that has extended to, open letters, lots of pressure for people to sign things, or letters that have been about various organizations in the birth world, pressurizing them to make statements about the conflict in the Middle East. And then there has also been a disturbing engagement by some of the healthcare unions in organized protests. There have been healthcare workers at protests with those union banners and also often wearing scrubs or, very much identifying themselves as healthcare workers, and sometimes even making a sort of virtue of that, that somehow because healthcare workers are visibly involved in a particular political stance, that gives it weight, that gives it focus. So there's been a lot of activity. And then I think what that has led to is a lot of Jewish birth workers and Jewish healthcare staff feeling very unwelcome, very even ostracized, and that has led to, in some cases, direct abuse. I've certainly had a lot of direct abuse whenever I have voiced any concerns about anti-Semitism or voiced the experience as a Jewish birth worker, Jewish midwife. So it's been sort of multi-layered. And I think at some stage in this conversation, it'd be interesting to talk about how blood libel in particular, I think, has been a very difficult aspect and has caused a lot of distress for Jewish birth workers, but has also been used and invoked to generate a lot of this activism. And I think people aren't aware of what blood libel is and the history of it and how it is being, you know, this historical trope has sort of have its contemporary manifestations.
BJ, would you like to add to that?
Yes. I mean, Laura said so many really important things. What I would like to add is that, which I think Laura implied, but just to make it really explicit, is that Jewish clients or patients don't feel safe in those circumstances either. So it's horrible for Jewish birth workers to go in, to be at work. I mean, Laura is wonderful about standing up, speaking up. Some people don't feel able to do that. Everybody's different. But also for the Jewish patients who are going in and they're thinking, wait, I just saw that person protesting outside the hospital and now they're going to provide care to me. How can I trust that their care is going to be unbiased, that they're going to treat me like they would treat any other person? And then I think an extra layer on top of that is that not only do we want to be treated like they'd treat any other person, we do also sometimes need people to be very aware of and respectful of our cultural traditions. So sometimes people are visibly Jewish, but even those who aren't necessarily visibly Jewish will have needs or requirements that they want us to meet because they're about their cultural traditions or about their religious beliefs. And they need to know that I'm coming into the hospital and I'm going to say, we're not naming the baby. We're, until the 8th day, we're going to have a circumcision, and that people aren't going to report them to social services. Or they need to know, well, it's Shabbat when I'm giving birth, and even though, the concept of saving a life is really important, I still am not going to press the buttons in the lift, and I need someone to do that for me. And they need to feel confident that they're going to come in and say those things or whatever it might be, and that people aren't going to treat them worse, differently than any other patient. And that's really important to think about as well.
Thanks.
100%. And actually yesterday, myself and a few others were giving evidence to the Amos Maternity and Neonatal Review as Jewish representatives, as Jewish women who've given birth. Myself, I've had 2 babies in the NHS, but also as a midwife and an activist in the space. And it was very disturbing to hear some of the stories from some of the Haredi women, particularly, who have had over anti-Semitism during the course of their treatment. And then I think anecdotally, I know we've picked up very much through this work that there are Jewish women who are not visibly Jewish necessarily, but they are choosing to directly hide their identity. They're not ordering kosher food because that might identify them. They're not wearing, their Star of David or et cetera, because they fear that will cause a prejudicial situation with healthcare staff, and that's really disturbing.
I think almost more so sort of in the maternity context, in that if you work in that world, you know that in order to have a safe birth and a good birth, you need to be in sort of a bubble of oxytocin and feeling very biologically safe and not feeling any kind of fright. Yeah. And so if you're feeling that underlying stress, throughout your care, that does actually have kind of very tangible effects on your birth outcomes.
Definitely. We know through our organization, Shifrah, that, Jewish women are asking for Jewish doulas or Jewish midwives, that matters to them. But if you're then in the situation where you've got a Jewish client or patient and a Jewish birth worker, and neither of them are feeling safe, that bubble of oxytocin that we thought we could provide, as Jews supporting other Jews, that is just completely shattered. And so that just makes it even more challenging to provide that space that we want to provide.
Yeah. So if we could pick up on the kind of thread that Laura introduced about the history of the blood libels and how, it's kind of showing up contemporarily, because I think a lot of people listening to this podcast would say, well, why is it that protesting, against what's going on in Israel and being against conflict and wanting conflict to end and, an end to death and destruction, how is that possibly anti-Semitic? Surely everyone would want that. So yeah, Laura, if you could kind of expand on why it is that seeing these protests against the conflict, or, like the kefirs and that kind of thing, can feel confronting, can feel anti-Semitic for Jewish women using, who are pregnant or perinatal. That would be helpful. Thanks.
Well, it's ironic because BJ lives in Norwich, which is where the original blood libel originates from. I think it's 1194 or something around there. So it was the first instance of blood libel where the Jewish community was falsely accused of killing a Christian child and using blood from that child in religious ceremonies, or often it's thought to be used in the creating matzah, which is the unleavened bread that you would use at Passover, which is, again, totally ironic because of Jewish law not to use any blood, not to have contact with blood. So it's a completely kind of inversion of what would be a Jewish law, and obviously a complete lie, fabrication. But that has been repeated throughout history, and has been used as a way to unfortunately invoke, pogroms and mass expulsions, etc. over our history. So I think the way that it plays out in a contemporary form is, and I'm sorry to use this phrase, but the way that, Israelis and often Jews themselves are called baby killers, and the way that the conflict in Gaza has been framed as being peculiarly focused on babies and children. And undoubtedly there have been a very disturbing and incredibly awful situation there, which I don't think we've got time or it's necessarily appropriate to go into all the reasons of it, but there have undoubtedly been a lot of deaths of civilians, and that population includes a lot of children and mothers and others. But to imply that the conflict is directly about that, or that is the intent behind the conflict, I think is a form of contemporary blood libel. And then that phrase is often used as a slur, as an insult, as a offensive way to, dismiss any kind of Jewish or Israeli aspects of the conflict, what happened on October the 7th, and any kind of rational debate around what the situation is. And so that is obviously very distressing for Jewish birth workers, because that's the population we look after. To be called a baby killer when you're a midwife, when that I look after babies, is, you can imagine, very, very distressing and upsetting. And it's very difficult to have a debate with anyone that is prepared to throw that slur at you, or to use that when they're on a protest, or to be using blood. Blood is, red paint is used as a proxy for blood in many protests and many actions as well. It's the same kind of thing, a blood libel, to imply that Israelis, Jews are particularly bloodthirsty or, violent. So that's the way things have played out, and it becomes this very extreme kind of binary situation, not something that one can address rationally. I've said that already, sorry. So I think that what we're seeing at the moment is these kind of very ancient anti-Semitic tropes being, manifesting in contemporary ways, and they're so embedded in our societies, because as I outlined, they are centuries old. They're so embedded, they almost seem, they have a life of their own. They seem to be truths that somehow have been revealed again in our contemporary life or times. And, you know, anti-Semitism really is the ultimate conspiracy theory. And we live in a time where conspiracy theories are very, very powerful, circulate very quickly and very wholesale through social media, particularly. So again, you see the kind of anti-Semitic playbook in its contemporary form played out at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to address it.
Yeah, and I think you know, you mentioned social media, Laura, and it is such an echo chamber. And so if somebody sees some material about, say, the blood libel and Jews being bloodthirsty, blood on our hands, that is what they will continue to see. They won't see any other side, any other information. And equally, the way internet search engines work these days, you get this kind of AI summary. So if somebody just typed in, you know, some short, you know, search into, I don't know, the Jewish blood libel or something, they're very likely to find a stereotyped view of it, misunderstandings, erroneous information. And people seem to have forgotten how to do research or have never learned how to do research, and they don't go further and they don't analyze. And as Laura said, you know, you close down conversation by just using terms like baby killer, or by, you know, the number of people who've said to me, like, oh, Zionism, that's such a bad thing. And they don't actually know what it means. But the way they have framed the discussion is that they're not interested in discussing it. You know, somebody, a friend of mine who's not Jewish, actually said, oh, Zionists, they're the bad guys, aren't they? You know, and at least she was my friend, and I felt I was able to kind of challenge her and to explain actually what Zionism is. But so many people don't have that in their lives, and instead just keep repeating these ideas and never getting them challenged, and aren't open to having them challenged either.
So how would you kind of explain Zionism if you needed to translate it for someone in a sentence or two?
To me, it's a super simple idea, and it's the idea that Jews have a homeland, that is Israel, and that we have the right to self-determination and safety in our homeland. And that's it. It's, you know, simple. And I think that I would say it's nothing more than that, but it's also nothing less than that. So it is really important.
I actually think that Zionism is dead. You know, we have the homeland, we have Israel, 78 years old. I think that I don't see the virtue or the benefit of talking about Zionism. Zionism has been enacted, you know,
Yes.
Unless you are implying that Israel should not exist, which is, I think, in some respects where we've got to, is that you were talking about people wanting to protest against war and conflict. I'm totally there. I would go on a protest that was about no conflict, peace, you know, discussion between peoples, accommodation of everybody, a peaceful solution, whatever form that takes. But what I see now is actually the activism has become about Israel should not exist. That's the end point. But actually Zionism is over. And somebody asked me this in a talk, actually, you know, what is Zionism? And I was going, well, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know if I can give you a really detailed description of the history of it and all the different forms of it. But what I don't like is the way that it's being used now as a slur, as an insult, as a pejorative term. And personally, I don't like using terms myself about myself. I mean, I think probably the only thing that I would call myself is a feminist. That's why I'm on, you know, Feminists Against Antisemitism. You know, I've always been a feminist, and I said that when it was you know, it wasn't popular in the 80s. I was calling myself a feminist, and everyone was saying to me feminism was over. So I'm a feminist. I'm also Jewish. I'm British. I'm a mother. I'm a sister, etc. But I don't ever like to necessarily use political ideology about myself. So I've never called myself a Zionist. Of course, I am a Zionist in the sort of fundamental way that BJ discusses, because I believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist. I have many family there and friends, and I don't want it to be destroyed. But I actually think the conversation is over about Zionism, and we should just, it's not useful, it's not productive.
No, but I think it's interesting because you never hear people saying, well, I don't think Pakistan should exist, or I don't think South Africa should exist, or name any country there. It's always about Israel in particular. And so I really like Laura's standpoint of, well, what's the point of discussing it? It is there. It's not going away. But of course, there are all these people who would like to see it be wiped off the face of the earth.
And I think that's where you talked about the reading of history, BJ, I think is really important, is that I don't think people fully know how it came to exist. They don't fully know the history of the Jewish people's relationship to Israel, for example, historically. They also don't necessarily know about all of the countries that were created after the Second World War. Jordan, many other countries didn't exist and were created after the Second World War. And one can look at that and talk about colonialism, and absolutely fine. That applies to those countries as much as it does probably to Israel, though I understand also Israel is a particular individual country and, has its own history, as every country does.
Yeah, and I think also another thing that people aren't aware of, besides kind of the general history, is that if you do try to explain to them where Israel came from, why it matters to the Jewish people, but also how it became this safe destination after World War II, then you enter a totally different conversation with some people where they deny the Holocaust. And so you're then at another stage of, okay, I've got to explain some more to you. And I've got to provide more evidence and more proof of things that have happened. And it almost feels never ending. So perhaps in a sense, maybe we shouldn't even be engaging in some of those conversations because they're so unproductive at times. But I think sort of as an educator at heart, I keep wanting to. And often it doesn't seem to lead anywhere, except maybe frustration for me.
Yeah. So there's a lot of kind of activism, very noisy activism, very prominent activism. So kind of from what you've been saying, I think like underlying a lot of that is perhaps kind of ignorance or misunderstanding about what they're protesting over, and also the history of it also, what Zionism actually means, and kind of how the baby killer, accusation links back to very, very kind of ancient tropes to do with Jews. Obviously, the NHS and the healthcare world is very kind of keen on equality, diversity, inclusion initiatives, and there's kind of mandatory training and that kind of thing. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on why it is that kind of anti-Semitism and sort of how that manifests hasn't cut through as a topic that people working in healthcare and in maternity are aware of and are informed about.
I think it's a lot to do, and this is just my analysis, is that the sort of anti-racism, which I totally, embrace, I think particularly comes from, I would suggest, a sort of American idea about race being particularly around how one identifies, and visually, and to do with Black activism and Black and brown people who absolutely we need to embrace, looking at that and the terrible statistics around the higher rates of death, particularly for Black women. Though I think a lot of the activism is bringing that down, which is fantastic. There's been a lot of really good work in that space. And I would say that I've been part of that work, absolutely, for all minorities. But I think within that framework, it's quite a binary view. There's not much nuance, and it tends to look at Black, white, Black, brown, oppressed, oppressor, privileged, not privileged. And it views Jews, the Jewish community, unfortunately, as being white exclusively, not understanding that there are many identities within Jewish culture. We have Ashkenazi, who perhaps would be mostly white adjacent, Sephardi from the Spanish and Portuguese side, that's my particular heritage, and then Mizrahi, who come from the Middle East and North Africa, and within Israel, for example, are about 45% of the population. Now, So they would be considered in those terms to be brown people, for example, or black, if they come from Africa particularly. So there's been there's very little understanding about Jewish culture. There's not even an understanding of the fundamentals that Jewish identity is both an ethnicity and a religion. And therefore the Jewish community has not been folded into that work at all. And it's been very hard work. And that's what, we've been trying to do in this new organization that we've co-founded, BJ and myself and others, Shifrah UK. We've been trying to have those conversations in that space and say, listen, one, using that framework, there are black and brown Jews, in fact, quite a lot of them. There might be people who don't actually have English as their first language living in the UK. They might speak Yiddish. Okay, so there are all sorts of issues that could quite easily align even with that methodology. Secondly, Jews, as we perhaps know, have been discriminated against for not being white. The Holocaust was because we were not white, and many of us are not white anyway in appearance. So that framework doesn't really work. And also Jews are a very small minority. They have particular cultural needs, as BJ was outlining earlier. And they are a community that is subject to the highest at the moment forms of hate crime as any other minority. So this is a minority community that needs to be considered within that framework. And that framework needs to absorb that, and it needs to expand in order to include the Jewish community.
I mean, Laura outlined that so well. I would just say that, Jews, I like to think of us as we're too white and not white enough simultaneously. We're too powerful, but we're also, powerless maggots. We're, too rich and yet the poorest of the poor. I mean, so it's this constant binary. And because of being almost on both sides of this binary, people are very dismissive of us. And a lot of EDI frameworks. So I actually am a consultant in equality, diversity, inclusion. And a lot of the frameworks do not have any space for Jews because they don't know where to fit us. And I love the term, personally, ethno-religion. So I always describe Jews were an ethno-religion, which obviously needs a bit of unpacking for many people. But even so, people go, well, I don't understand then. If you're in the UK, so if someone discriminates against you, is it because of your race? Is it because of your religion? What is it? And you're trying to say, well, it crosses boundaries. So I think that's all part of the issue. Also, EDI is being kind of shrunk in many places, especially in the United States, but also here in the UK, where companies, organizations, perhaps us including the NHS, maybe have less money for it. They also don't always know who to hire to do training. And then there is the fact that we are a teeny tiny minority. And so the argument kind of understandably comes, well, okay, but if we're going to talk about the Jews, we also need to talk about this group and that group. And do we have the space for all of that? Do we have the time for all of it? Do we have the money for all of it? And, sometimes they come to the conclusion that they don't. And finally, I would add that I've been told as part of my EDI consultancy work that actually this is too controversial a subject to talk about right now. And I can sit there and argue, but that's why we need to have these hard conversations because of the huge rates of discrimination, anti-Semitism that we're seeing. And they'll say, yes, but our staff will complain, or our shareholders, or I'm not sure that the optics on this would be great. And, that's really painful as well to hear that people are saying, I see that, the Jewish people are suffering, but actually we're going to suffer more if we even talk about it.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, that almost presumptive nervousness or anxiety about even trying to address the subject. Because when I've gone to give talks about this at conferences and with student midwives, I've never actually had a problem. I've never had anyone being confrontational. I've had lots of people conversely coming up to me afterwards going, oh, thank you for talking about this, if they're Jewish, but also non-Jewish people saying, thank you, I didn't know so much about this. It was really informative. I have Jewish clients. I now feel more, educated to support them better. So I think a lot of it actually is imaginary or fear that we can't touch that subject because it's too difficult.
And I think that's also related to what I'm seeing in the publishing industry, where publishers are saying, to use Laura's term sort of preemptively, oh, we're not going to publish something that's on a Jewish topic or by a Jewish author because what would people say? What would people think? And actually, I think they're doing people a disservice and kind of underestimating our kind of human curiosity and our desire to learn more and to do better.
I asked Laura, as a kind of clinical midwife, if a Jewish woman was coming and booking as, someone who's pregnant, is there a way that is recorded in her notes in the data? Because it kind of falls in between sort of religion and ethnicity. Is it recorded? And if it isn't kind of recorded, then how do we have data on what's happening?
That's a really good question and that came up yesterday at the maternity review. That's a very fundamental issue that me and many other people are trying to address in organizations, is that I think there was a reluctance by the Jewish community, this is what I've heard, from having that as an identity up to this point. And I think now there's a recognition that it's really, really important to collect data to understand what's going on, to understand the impact of anti-Semitism in healthcare with that data. So at the moment, it's generally just under religion. And what we're trying to push for is for it to be as an ethnicity as well. Because, for example, myself, I don't really practice religiously as a Jew, but I'm on a very foundational level a Jewish person. That's my identity. That's my ethnicity. If you look back at as my sister has done, the DNA, it's Jewish all the way. That is my ethnicity. It's in my DNA. So I would like to be able to record that for myself, for my sense of identity and pride, but also it's very important in order for us to collect information about what is the impact on this rising level of anti-Semitism on people's, as you were saying at the beginning, are the birth outcomes that are different? We know anecdotally people are feeling scared and concerned and expressing that to us and others, but to actually collect some real data is very, very important.
Can I just add an anecdote there about when I was pregnant with my first child, and I went to, the booking an appointment with the midwife, and you're supposed to answer questions about your identity and so on. And I said, oh, well, I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. And she said, what is that? And where would I put it? So are you Black Irish? Are you, she was trying to fit it into the box. And I said, well, I'm not British anyway. I'm, from the United States. But, and I was trying to explain to her, and she just had no understanding. She said, I've never met anybody like you before. Said, well, you probably have. You maybe just weren't aware of it. And she said, well, where do these Ashkenazi, whatever, people come from? And so I was trying to explain our history a little bit. And she said, oh, right. Okay. So you're Eastern European. I said, well, it's not quite that simple. And so I went a little further back and I said, and she, oh, okay, so Israel, so that means you're Middle Eastern? And again, it was kind of like, not quite. And then she said, but where? And I said, and I shouldn't have said this, but then I went, well, all humans came from Africa. And she went, oh, okay, I'll take African then. That's not right either. And the reason why I felt it was so important to kind of emphasize this to her was because obviously the genetic illnesses that Jews pass on, and I wanted to see if I could get any testing. She'd never heard of any of them. She didn't know about that. I never did get any testing. But also I feel like it's really important where possible to keep emphasizing our identity and to show, these little forms with their tick boxes, we don't fit in neatly to the boxes as they are. And we need to change that, just like Laura was talking about. We can't just say it's a religion. We need to talk about the culture and sort of the ethnicity of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, to highlight also the clinical kind of impacts of that as well in terms of the genetics. That's a side that I hadn't considered. Thanks, BJ. But moving back a little bit now to the mental health kind of side of things, because it is, Maternal Mental Health Week. I mean, you've touched on it a little bit already, but I'd just like to hear from you a little bit about how the rising anti-Semitism over the last couple of years is impacting on the Jewish women that you look after in your practice.
I think that it's had a very, very negative effect on Jewish birth workers, and we are women too. And, many of my colleagues who are midwives or doulas, they've also had babies in the last few years. So we can have this dual role, and we do, because we're a female workforce predominantly. I think it's caused a lot of mental distress. I myself have felt very distressed at times. I felt victimized. I felt isolated, sidelined, ostracized. And it's made me, I would say, to some extent, fearful at work, fearful of negativity and prejudice by any colleagues. Often I'm seeing colleagues on social media doing actions. So, even that extended sort of network of colleagues in the profession, because I'm quite well connected in the profession outside of my immediate, work family. And I think for the women, certainly there's been a lot of feedback about them also. And I think BJ was outlining this before. They are fearful of going in to give birth. Will they get equitable care? Will they get kind care? And will people be wearing political insignia on their uniforms, which is something that we've really had to fight, because that's completely unprofessional and against our code of conduct. But many people have up until perhaps very recently, and perhaps still are. So I think it's caused widespread distress within the profession and within the birthing community. And that's really unprecedented from my experience and very, very concerning.
Yeah. And I mean, Laura has much more experience with it than I do because that is your profession. But I would just say that even here in Norfolk, we have quite a small Jewish community. I have felt completely ostracized from the doula groups and from kind of the lactation community. And I've had to leave all the organizations I was a member of because of the anti-Semitism that I experienced there. And so on a personal level, that was all very painful. And some of the cruel things that people said to me, they were obviously very hurtful and shocking. It also made me kind of question. I thought these people were my colleagues, sometimes even friends. What was that all founded on? Sometimes when I tried to speak up, I was met with such resounding silence, which was almost as bad as the kind of nasty abuse. Because I thought, well, maybe they'll just write to me privately and say, well, I don't feel able to speak up, but I'm with you. We're saying nobody did. So I had to leave all those groups, as I said, and that then means that I'm not advertising my services anywhere. So I have not worked as a doula since October 7th now, part because I left all those organizations, and I've had very kind of minimal dealings now with the kind of doula and lactation community, whereas I was quite an active part of it before. So financially, it's really impacted me as well.
Really hit your kind of livelihood then in that case.
It definitely did. So, when people say to me, what do you do? I no longer really talk about the doula or the lactation work because I feel, how can I justify saying that when, I barely make anything from it? However, the positive side for me has been that I posted something a couple of years ago in one of the doula Facebook groups, and someone that Laura and I both know saw what I posted because I was speaking up against the anti-Semitism there, and all these people piled onto me, and one person wrote a supportive message and then contacted me privately. She was also a Jewish doula and kind of led me to Laura and to Shifrah. So the positive has been that I've met lots of really wonderful, intelligent people and formed a new community. But yeah, the negative is still there. And that's just me personally. And I know that the same has happened to some of our colleagues and friends. And, Laura and I, we don't need to go on and on about, personal stories, but we both know people who have had potential clients contact them and ask, I need to know before we go any further, are you a Zionist? Or, what are your political beliefs, which is just totally inappropriate.
I think it's caused incredible fracture in the birth world. And because we're such a small minority, we are the ones that have sort of ended up very much on our own. And then we've had to create community between ourselves in order to have some kind of collective voice to address what's been going on, and also to gain support personally through these times. And I echo what BJ says, that has been wonderful in strange consequence in terms of I found a new community. However, that doesn't justify the really bad treatment and difficulties that we've all experienced on the way.
And also, I think that the isolation and the abuse has really made me question my future living in the UK, because yes, it's amazing that we have our sort of Jewish safe space, but part of the joy of living in a place like the UK or the US is the diversity and getting to know people in all sorts of areas and from different backgrounds and walks of life and all of that. But if I'm becoming more and more isolated, what is the point? And I feel I've lost a lot of, well, I was going to say friends, but maybe I'll put the friends in quotation marks now because clearly they weren't my friends. And my life has really shrunk in a way that, has been hard to reckon with.
I definitely feel a huge loss of trust in my colleagues and other professionals. I now regrettably approach people that aren't Jewish with a sense of trepidation, and I wonder, are they an ally? Are they not an ally? Are they going to be safe to be with? And when I go to conferences, particularly to speak on this subject, I am quite nervous, and I'm very aware of sort of who's sort of ignoring me, where's the silences, and who's coming up to me and being supportive. It's a completely different dynamic to I used to go to loads of other professional events, and never in a million years would I have thought, oh, being Jewish is now a risky stance.
No.
And I guess that's similar for women who are pregnant, who are, entering the birth room, that they're going to be thinking the same things about the people who are looking after them.
Definitely. And that's not what they should be thinking about. They should be thinking about, wow, I'm about to welcome a baby to the world. And this is the most miraculous thing, it's the everyday miracle. And they should be thinking about their health, their well-being, and, all the plans they have for the birth, but also for the future. But instead, exactly, to use Laura's term, they have this sense of trepidation and who's going to be there? How are they going to treat me?
I mean, I think it was in that Panorama film, Dave Rich from the CST, Community Safety Trust, was talking about how anti-Semitism has come into every sector of society since October the 7th. So it used to be maybe some kind of fringe that, you would be aware, maybe far right, maybe even far left. There was, and obviously all the Jeremy Corbyn and all that kind of stuff. One would be aware that there are pockets of it, and it would be very easy to avoid it, but you didn't feel that it was pervasive in society. And it certainly, as I said, was never an issue in healthcare for me over 10 years. And that's completely changed. It's in every aspect of society now.
It is. And, I even notice it at things. I mean, maybe I have a chip on my shoulder and I'm just fearful generally now because of everything. But, even if I take one of my children to a birthday party and, other parents are sitting in their little cliques and talking to each other, and I feel like people aren't talking to me the way they used to. And, is that my perception? Is there something real? Is it some combination? And it's, most places are a little bit scary now in a way, and I worry about the impact it's going to have on our patients.
And I think in terms of mental health, we have to then understand that a pregnant woman or person coming to us is going to have experienced this in society, directly, indirectly. It's everywhere. So their mental health, their sense of well-being, their sense of safety has most likely been affected by what's been going on before they were pregnant, and now even more, because when you are pregnant, you're in a more vulnerable state. They're perhaps going to be even more at risk of that affecting their mental health and well-being, and then perhaps having fears, as we've said, about what might happen when they actually enter these spaces. So I think I've talked to a lot of Jewish women who are making sure they see a Jewish therapist, for example, because again, that's a space where they don't know if they'll be safe with a therapist who's not Jewish. But I think a lot of Jewish people have sought therapy because of the trauma that they felt from what's been going on.
And actually, we know somebody who is a Jewish psychotherapist who's part of Shifrah, and who has talked about how the psychotherapy world has gotten very anti-Semitic, and Jews have been kind of hounded out of some of the spaces there too, including places that were supposedly, anti-racist. Oh, it's our anti-racist discussion group, except we don't want Jews here. So, now people are going for therapy to therapists who are also experiencing trauma themselves. And that's also very difficult.
I think that's kind of another, like, psychotherapy and maternity, you would expect kind of them to really model, and I think people that work in there really think that they do model kind of, empathy, compassion, being able to hold space for complexity and, hold two things in their heads at the same time. Why do you think it's not happening? Why do you think that is? What are the root causes?
Going back to, I think, the anti-racist frameworks, I think Jews have been cast as the villains of the scene. And that's traditionally what we are, that anti-Semitism is always justified. Jews are a danger to society. And now we see, people make this narrative now that if Israel was sorted out, Israel didn't exist, all the ills of the world will be over, omni cause, So I'm afraid it's the same dynamic, that Jews are particularly evil, they're destabilizing, they have dual purpose, to Israel and the country they live in. They are not to be trusted, they have power. So all of these old narratives, again, as I was saying, these old tropes are very much in evidence at the moment. And so that feels then justified to victimize them, because actually they are the oppressors. They are they cast as the destabilizers. As I say, it's the ultimate conspiracy theory.
And people will say, you bring it on yourselves, because if you speak up and say, do you see the increased anti-Semitism? Well, it's your own fault. You bring it on yourself. And as Laura said, they use that to justify what they say and do to us.
So we have a current situation where being, anti-Zionist, which is the sort of contemporary form of anti-Semitism, is actually gives you cultural capital. It's a positive position, particularly in progressive spaces. So people are completely blind to its racist implications and the way it plays out for the Jewish community. I think people do not see that.
Shall we move on to something a little bit more positive then? I mean, you've mentioned it a couple of times, the organisation Shifrah that you have built as a response to what's going on. It'd be really nice to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. BJ, go for it.
Well, I mean, in many ways, it's Laura's brainchild, and Laura's our kind of galvanizing force. You are a force to be reckoned with. And
I'm a good day.
No, always, I think. And, because you're not afraid to stand up. And I think, I wasn't there at the sort of very initial formation. I mean, I'm kind of a co-founder, but you were starting it a little before I joined, or I was brought on board, or whatever term we want to use. And I think it came out of the anti-Semitism we were experiencing that we've already discussed, and the desire to make a safe space, not just for Jewish birth workers, although that's important, but also for Jewish clients and patients, a place where they could come to access, correct information, useful information, where they could potentially find Jewish birth workers or Jewish allied birth workers, because we have some people who are not Jewish themselves, but who support and want to work with Jews. And so we want to advocate for Jews in the birth world. Laura will say more.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of evolution of it was really that very quickly after October the 7th, I was really horrified and shocked by a lot of what I was seeing online. So I started kind of posting just in response to that. And that sort of brought lots of people to contact me saying kind of, thank you for saying that, or it's really good to hear someone speaking up. And so we started these sort of informal Zoom sessions where it was just a space where, Jewish birth workers, and we also had some allies at the beginning and academics, where we could just talk about what was going on and the trauma of what was going on and the kind of complete sort of breakdown that we were all feeling was happening in our lives. And then out of that, I kind of posited the idea that I think we should try to create something here together so that we can have this collective voice, so we can, because just as an individual, I was finding I was having conversations with people. So there would be, some kind of open letter that was like a blatant blood libel and absolutely horrific. And hundreds of people, many of whom I knew, were signing these letters. And sometimes I would contact people personally, message them like, oh, I was really disturbed to see that did you understand what's going on? And even though they would often say, oh, I didn't really read it properly, I just signed it because so and so signed it and I thought it was okay. Even when I tried to explain my distress at it, or that it was founded on lies and anti-Semitic tropes, they would not withdraw their name from that list. So I could see the social pressure, the peer pressure to turn up and virtue signal in this way. So I thought, actually, I can't carry on just sort of randomly, personally trying to address this. We need to do something together and support ourselves, but also do some of this really vital education kind of awareness work. Because like we said previously in the conversation, there's such a low understanding. There's so much ignorance about who Jews are, what our culture is, what our heritage is, anti-Semitic tropes, that I just thought on a really basic level, and I'm not an educator really in that space. I mean, I'm a sort of arts healthcare educator. But even I can do this very basic education because people's understanding is so low. So I just thought we really need to try and do this work, and we need to find a way to support Jewish families and Jewish birth workers and do this education and training work. And that's basically what we've been trying to do. And I think at the highest levels of the profession, we're really being embraced, which is fantastic. So, the NMC, Nursing and Midwifery Council, has embraced us. We're having conversations, not always easy to have, but we are. The Royal College of Midwives have embraced us. Lots of conferences, have accepted our abstracts. We're talking in these spaces. So I think there is an open door there. And the work is difficult and it's long term, but we're making some headway, I would say.
Yes, and we've started offering workshops and developing pamphlets and training for people as well, and we're hoping to reach more. But I think, as Laura said, some people are really embracing us, but we have also met some resistance in some places, which is not surprising, but is disappointing.
Yeah, experiencing. So it's kind of education, it's advocacy, and it's also somewhere where if you're a Jewish woman and you're pregnant, you could find a Jewish birth worker who might be able to support you.
That's right.
Yeah. How would they find you? What's the website?
Right. So it's shifrah.org.uk.
And Shifrah is spelled Shifrah, and we're named after a Jewish midwife featured in the Torah, the Jewish Bible.
Yes, shifrah.org.uk, as BJ says, spelled Shifrah. So Shifrah and Puah were the first midwives in the Bible. We don't know if they were Israelites or not, but they were tasked with killing the Israelites' firstborn, and they refused to do that by saying that every time they got there, that the Israelites were so quick at giving birth that the baby's already been born, and so they'd missed the opportunity. So they were kind of also disruptors and to patriarchy. So I think they're great kind of feminist heroes.
Fabulous. So as well, I know, BJ, you've recently published a book, so I was wondering if you might want to tell us more about that.
Sure. It's called Be Fruitful, the Jewish Pregnancy and Birth Guide. And I kind of had multiple purposes, I suppose, in writing it. One was for my Jewish audience, because I wanted to show them the range of things that are possible for Jews, because as Laura said, many of us are not religious, but our culture still matters to us. And sometimes we have to think about, okay, I'm about to have a baby. What do I want to do? How do I want to do a baby naming? Do I want to circumcise, not circumcise? What traditions? And do I want prayers said while I'm giving birth, or whatever, lots of things to think about. So I wanted to show a range of stories, and also give the history behind it. Some people, for example, like to, I would call it a bit of a superstition, but for some people it matters to hang a sort of red thread, a red string, while they're giving birth, as a way of kind of protecting them and fending off the evil eye. And, so they could see the options, but also to think about things like, okay, what does the Torah say about breastfeeding? How long do Jews traditionally breastfeed for? And what are our views on it today? And what have people said about it, or any particular topic there? So it was partially to give lots of information. Also, I wanted to have inspiring stories and to hear from a range of people with different religious and cultural backgrounds, and what they chose to do. But my other audience, of course, is the non-Jewish audience, and ideally those who are working in healthcare in some way, especially related to the birth world. And I wanted them to have that information too, so they knew more about Jews, to kind of deal with that ignorance that Laura and I have been talking about. But also, I wanted them to think about how they could do better. So what are things that could help them make their Jewish patients or clients more comfortable? What are things that they need to know when working with Jews? And so it was kind of for all these different audiences, but the basic aim is to be informative, educational, and also ideally a bit entertaining too. And I did a huge amount of research for it and interviewed so many people. And it was great for me because I heard about experiences that were totally different from my own. And I learned a lot about, for example, the more religiously observant, because that's not my experience.
It's a brilliant book. Everyone should get it.
Oh, thank you.
And we do actually, I think the way that you framed it is really important, because when we give talks at conferences and things, we talk about Jewish cultural safety. So that's partly to kind of align it with the anti-racist EDI kind of terminology so that people kind of understand it should be included in that. But also because we don't just talk about anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism training. It's about Jewish cultural safety. So it's about, yes, aspects of anti-Semitism and the tropes and etc. But it's also about how best to support Jews in their cultural practices.
Yeah, and Laura was explaining earlier about Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and of course we have Ethiopian Jews and Indian Jews, and most people are not aware of that. So I even explained those kinds of things, and I explained the different religious groups. You could be an atheist Jew, you could be a Reformed Jew, a Hasidic, all these, and it's a huge gamut there too. And so I just wanted to give that information so people felt, oh yeah, okay, I understand more about Jews now. And even for Jews to think that too, because sometimes we just don't know about the other groups.
Yeah. And is it available in bookshops or Amazon? Like, how would you be?
It's definitely available on Amazon and in some bookshops as well. And and also I just wanted to say that I mentioned earlier that publishing is not a very welcome place for Jews at the moment. And a lot of Jewish authors have found that publishers are not wanting to publish their books. Agents don't want to take them on. And this is a publishing company called Proclaris, and they do kind of all books about birth and pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I've published a couple of books with them before, one about LGBTQ plus parenting and some on lactation and so on. And I kind of approached them tentatively, and I said, I'm aware that you might find this controversial, you might be worried about the bottom line. And they were so supportive, and they said, no, that is really important. They're not Jewish. They said, this is such an important topic. We have to do it. We need to do it. And they have really been wonderful. And that is an unusual story these days in publishing, that they want to talk about those issues and that they were willing to support me. It's a little bit sad that I have to point that out, but it is a unique experience now.
It's a great segue to my final question for you both, which is the theme of World Maternal Mental Health Day this year is Stronger Together. So my question to you is, how can women, so both Jewish and non-Jewish women, come together to support and advocate for Jewish mothers as they navigate their pregnancies, births, and postnatal periods in the current context?
I think just being really open. I mean, I tried to have some conversations like this at conferences and professional contexts to particularly talk to other groups who are advocating for, particular ethnicity or group, to say we should be coming together, we should be supporting each other. I have always supported lots of activist groups and causes, and I have been very shocked to not only not have support, but have active aggression against wanting to advocate for the Jewish community. So I really hope we can break that down and we can work together for the benefit of, all women and birthing people. This is such a vulnerable time in a woman and a person's life. It's such an important time. It's a massive life event that I think politics needs to be as far away from this space as possible, and we need to look at people as individuals and celebrate their individual identities, cultural, religious, whatever, sexuality, gender, and just really embrace those ethics and look to support everybody. Sorry, it sounds a bit like, peace and love for everybody, but I mean, really, it's been so shocking that this has happened in the birth world, where everything we're taught is about be with woman, be with person, love, care, compassion, individualized care, cultural sensitivity, curiosity, cultural safety, and yet suddenly this kind of massive rupture has happened, as I said. So I really hope we can get back to how things were, which was, you know, nothing's ideal, and there's always campaigns and there's always work to be done, absolutely. But we all need to be working towards this positive goal for women.
I completely agree. And all I would add is that, you know, we're all human beings. And so everybody should be treated with respect and love and kindness, with attention paid to the small things that are different about us, because ultimately someone going through birth is someone going through birth. They might have different desires about, oh, how do I decorate my room? Or what's my playlist? Or, you know, is my partner there, not there? You know, different feelings. What kind of food will I eat? Those are relatively small things in the shape of what we're doing in the course of a life. And I think it's just remembering to see the humanity in one another that's extremely important.
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you again for your time and for kind of discussing this difficult topic, but also for the work that you're doing. Just congratulations on, you know, founding Shifrah, writing Be Fruitful. That's really helping to plug the EDI gap that we have. So, you know, it's great that people listening to this podcast will be able to access those resources and become more informed and know that, you know, advocacy is happening. So yeah, thank you for your time and thank you for your work. And yeah,
well, thank you also to Feminists Against Antisemitism. We totally support what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. And thank you for having us here today.